Security Configuration Wizard. You might have heard the term reducing the attack surface of a computer before, and you completely understand what's meant by that term. But for some of you, you're still scratching your head, wondering what we're all talking about. What reducing the attack surface means is to reduce the areas of a computer that's vulnerable to being attacked. For example, many years ago, Microsoft had problems with IIS being a big security hole that malicious people would actively target since they knew that security was weak. The problem is, at least back in Windows 2000, IIS was turned on by default whether you wanted it or not. So if you didn't need IIS, the best thing you could do is to turn it off altogether, and that would close off one area of attack. After all, if there isn't IIS on the server, you can't attack it. The same idea, of course, could then be applied to all of the other applications and services that might run on a server that you don't need. And you'll find that there's a lot of services that might be required for, say, a DNS server to function, but some of those same services might not be required for a print server, for example. So, knowing what features to enable or disable all works in your favour, reducing the available areas that a malicious user can attack. Or in other words, you're reducing the attack surface of the computer. In Windows 2008, we can use the Security Configuration Wizard to create a security policy that we can then use to apply to our servers to lock them down, which of course will reduce the attack surface of the server. So we'll click on Start and we'll go to Administrative Tools and we'll launch the Security Configuration Wizard. Now we'll click Next and we can create a new security policy, we can edit an existing security policy, we can apply an existing policy that we might have already created, and this is what we'll do if we already have created a policy and we want to use it on other servers that we're deploying. And finally, we can roll back to the last applied policy if we happen to be testing a new one and it has some problems. So since we haven't created any policies yet, let's choose the first option to create one and we'll click Next. Okay, now we'll need to select a server to use as a baseline for this policy. Now, since we're looking to build a baseline security policy, you'll need to give some consideration as to what it is that you're trying to secure. If it's a DNS server, then you'll want to enter in the name of one of your DNS servers in here. If it's a DHCP server, then enter in the name of one of your DHCP servers. Now, ideally, you're going to want to create a couple of types of policies. One that's a generic security policy, and then build it on a server that's just been installed and it doesn't have any roles on it. And then you'll want to create another one for your role-based servers. Now, since this server that I'm on right now is a domain controller, let's run through this Security Configuration Wizard using the assumption that we'll be focusing on creating a security configuration policy for domain controllers. However, we could easily do it for a DNS server, a web server, a terminal services server, and so forth. We will also need to have administrator privileges on this server as well, so if you don't, then you'll need to exit the wizard now and restart it using Run As, and then provide the credentials of an account that has the right permissions. So I'm going to leave the default here at DCO1, which is this server, and we'll click Next. And then the wizard will go off and process the security configuration database. Now we could view this configuration database as well if we like, and this is more for informational purposes than anything else. So here you can see 5 separate areas of configuration if you like. So let's select one. We'll select the top one, Server Roles. And this will expand out and show us a whole bunch of different Windows Server roles that we can dig down further into. So let's choose one here. Let's choose Domain Controller since it is a domain controller that I'm on. And this will expand out, and in here you'll be able to see all of the things that will be needed to run a domain controller role, such as the DFS namespace, DFS replication, file server, and all of these services and firewall rules, and these sorts of things are going to need to be configured. Now, you can go through all of this at your own leisure if you like. As I said, it's more for informational purposes than anything else, but it's still good to take a look at. Alright, well let's click Next, and this will move on to the next part of the wizard, which is where we'll be configuring services based on the server's role. So we'll click Next again, and then the wizard's going to list all of the roles that we currently have installed on this server. So here on this domain controller, we have the roles that we just saw in the configuration database, the DFS namespace, DFS replication, we have DNS server, obviously the domain controller role, file server, and if we scroll down a little bit, we also have the remote security configuration and analysis, which is what we'll use to configure, analyze, or roll back our security configuration policy on this server. And finally, we have the volume shadow copy role, which is what lets us run backup jobs on this server. Now, anything that you see here with a tick next to it are the actual roles that this server actively performs, and anything without a tick in it are those roles that might be installed on this server just by default. So, for example here, we could see that our server does have a print server role, but do we really need it on our domain controller? These are the sorts of things you'll need to do. Decide which roles you really need on the server for it to function as a domain controller or a DNS server or a web server or whatever the server's doing. Anything you don't need, uncheck the box. Anything you do need, then check the box. It's pretty simple, but will probably take a bit of thought. Now at the top here in the drop-down box, we're currently showing all of the installed roles on this server, but we can choose to show all of the roles, and that'll show everything, which obviously includes potential roles that aren't installed on this server, but are of course available to be installed through the Server Manager console. We can also see all the uninstalled roles, and just the ones that we have selected as well. Now, once you've run through this list and determined what roles you really require on this server, we'll click Next. And then we'll need to do the same thing again for the client features as well. Again, select the client features that this server will need to have installed and remove the ones you don't need, and then click Next again. Now we'll need to select which options we want to be available for us to be able to administer this server, and it's definitely worth taking a look at these, such as things like, say, the remote administration options, as some of these will be pretty important to you if you want to manage the server remotely. Again, you can go through this list and check the ones that you need, deselect what you don't, and then click Next again. Now we can select any additional services that might be running on this server and decide if we still need them to be running. And what I have here on this server are the Hyper-V services that I'm using to run this domain controller in a Hyper-V virtual session, so I'll need to have those running, so I'm going to leave them as they are and we'll click Next. Alright, now when this security policy is applied, if there are services running that we haven't explicitly specified in this policy, what do we want to do with them? Now, we could choose to leave them as they are, whether they be in an automatic or a disabled state, it really doesn't matter, they'll remain unaffected, or we can disable the service. Now, in a highly secure environment, you'll probably want to disable them, but most of the time, you'll leave the default and just have them as they are. For example, if you had an endpoint monitoring service like Tivoli running on this server, or perhaps a backup agent, and the wizard here didn't pick up on it, if we chose to disable them, then those applications would stop working. So give it some thought before you click disable, or just leave the default as it is. Now we'll get a summary list of what the services running on this server will look like when we apply this security configuration policy. For example, the application experience service is currently set to automatic, but once we apply this policy, it's going to be set to disabled. Again, we've got a whole bunch of other services that have been set to manual here, and once we apply this policy, a lot of them are going to be disabled. And since a lot of these aren't required to run on a domain controller, disabling them will reduce the attack surface of our server, and also the performance of our service would even be better since we aren't running a whole bunch of services that we aren't even using. Now this screen here by default only shows services that will be changed as a result of applying this policy, but you can choose to see all of them as well. Alright, we'll click Next. And now we're done with configuring the role-based section of the security configuration wizard, so we'll move on now to the network security section. And you will note that down here you can skip sections of this wizard if you like, as the wizard is pretty long, but in my opinion, how could you really be confident that your system is secure if you only secure a certain part of it? So we'll continue, we'll click Next, and in this section we'll be configuring the network security rules for the Windows firewall. Now, pretty much every rule in here will be configured, and a lot of them you'll see will be specific to the roles on this server. So you can see we've got a whole bunch of domain controller specific rules, and if we scroll down you're going to see a whole bunch of core networking rules as well as things like DNS and DHCP and file and printer sharing and replication. So again, You can configure these if you like to further lock down your system, and we can do that by highlighting a rule and clicking on the Edit button. And I will point out that since these are all predefined rules, there isn't a lot of configuration that you're able to do here. We can leave the default to allow all connections or only allow secure connections, and everything else is greyed out with the exception of on the Scope tab, where we're able to further mitigate risk to this server by allowing only specific IP addresses to access this server. Obviously the default is to allow any IP address to contact this server, but you can change that if you like. Now at this point, if you do want to add in your own rules, you can click on the Add button and then add them in as well. But for most of the roles included in Windows Server 2008, the default rules will generally be fine. So we'll click Next and we'll move on to the next section, which is the Registry section of the wizard. And we can specify if we want to enable server message block security signatures. Now the default is to enable SMB, but in doing so will require that any computer that plans on connecting to this server will be at minimum running any of these operating systems you see here or higher. But in most cases, companies should well be past these old operating systems by now. Now secondly, ensure that the server does have the extra CPU power required to digitally sign all file and print traffic, which will help prevent attacks that attempt to modify traffic in transit. So if we leave both of these boxes checked as they are, we'll be enabling SMB signing, so I'll leave them as they are. And do take note that these settings will modify this registry key down the bottom here if you want to go and take a look at it. Now I'll also point out that you can enforce this setting via a group policy object as well. So if we go and click on Start and choose Administrative Tools, we'll launch the Group Policy Management console. Now we'll expand our forest here and I'll expand my domain, and I'm just going to right click on my default domain policy and choose Edit so we can check out this policy. Now under our computer configuration heading, we're going to expand policies, we'll expand Windows settings, security settings, then we'll expand local policies and we'll choose security options. Now in the right hand side here we'll scroll down, and the policy that we're looking for is to digitally sign communications always. Now if we right click on this and choose property and then choose to enable this policy, then we'll need for our clients to be able to support it, or they won't be able to contact our servers. But the upside is that you probably aren't using those old operating systems anymore, and secondly, it's much more secure and prevents man-in-the-middle attacks. The downside is that in Microsoft's own documentation, they say that it can downgrade file serving performance by up to 15%, so I'll leave it up to you to decide what's best. Although, since this is a video on security, what good would it be if I didn't recommend the more secure route? And by the way, on a domain controller, this policy is enabled by default in the default domain controller policy, so you don't need to do anything unless, of course, you want that same level of security for your member servers. Well, let's go back to our security configuration wizard now, and we'll click Next, and then we can also require LDAP signing as well. But this will require a minimum of Windows 2000 machines running Service Pack 3 or higher, so you can enable that if you like. Now we'll need to configure what type of challenge response authentication we'll use for making outbound connections. The default is to use domain accounts, and that's what we'll use, so we'll click Next. We can also set which authentication level we'll use, and that defaults here to Windows NT with Service Pack 6 or higher, and that rules out Windows 95 and 98. We can also require that the clock be synchronized, and that's required for NTLM version 2 authentication to work. So if you're running Windows 2000 or above, then we can check this box as it's more secure. Now we'll click Next. And now we can configure inbound authentication, and this is for computers that want to connect to this server. Now we can firstly require that computers that need LAN manager authentication can connect, and that's all of these older operating systems that you see here. So if you don't have any of these old legacy operating systems hanging around, then you can uncheck this box. We can choose to allow computers that have not yet been configured to use NTLM version 2 authentication. And if we're configuring a domain controller, we have a third option here to allow computers using a RAS or a VPN connection to connect to a RAS server that aren't running Windows 2003 with Service Pack 1 or later. Now I'm just going to uncheck the top box here since I don't need any legacy clients to connect to this server, and we'll leave the other defaults as they are. We'll click Next, and we'll get a summary here of what options we chose, and if you're happy with your choices, we'll click Next again, and we'll move on to the final part of the security configuration wizard, which is the auditing section. Now the default here is to turn auditing on for successful activities, which are changes to system and configuration files, and this will allow you, as the text suggests here, to reconstruct events after the fact to determine who changed any system or configuration files. We can turn off auditing altogether, and I wouldn't recommend that in a security conscious environment, and down the bottom we can choose to audit both successful and unsuccessful activities, which will of course log denied attempts to access files, but it has the downside of both writing a lot more data and then slowing the system's performance slightly. Now, in a highly secure environment, you'll probably want to enable this last option, but for most companies, just auditing successful activities is fine, so we'll leave the default as it was and we'll click Next. We'll get our summary here, which tells us what settings we've configured, and that's to log all successful activities, including things like log-on events, account management, directory services, and so forth. And down the bottom here, we're going to include the SCW audit security template, which sets system access control list so we can audit access of the file system. Now this will enable our server to record write accesses by any user to any of the configuration or executable files in the Windows directory structure. So this is a good feature, so I reckon you should leave that on as well. Okay, well we'll click Next, and now we're able to save our policy. And this will be saved to an XML file, so since this is a domain controller, I'm going to call my policy here DC, and it'll be saved in this default location here. Now, if you don't enter in an XML file extension here, by the way, it doesn't matter, as the wizard will append it to the file anyway. Now, we can also add in a description if we like, and that's certainly a good idea. Down the bottom here, we can choose to view a new security policy if we like. And this will fire up the same configuration database viewer that we saw earlier on at the start of this wizard, except this time we're able to drill down into this and see what configuration settings that we've configured rather than just seeing all of them. So for example, if we click on, say, Audit, we'll see most of the successful events being audited and most of the failed ones not being audited, exactly as we configured it a moment ago. And we can also choose to include any other security templates as well. And that can be useful if, as part of this security configuration, you skip certain sections as you've already configured them earlier. Well, you can go and click Add, and then add them in here as well. Alright, well, we'll click Next, and then we can choose to apply this configuration policy later on, which is the default, or we can apply it right now. So let's apply it later. We'll click Next, and we'll click Finish, and then we're done. Alright, now that we've created our security policy, which was for domain controllers in this case, we can then apply it to our domain controllers. So how do we do that? Well, we have three ways. We could fire up the security configuration wizard again and apply it manually. We could use another application like SMS, but that's really out of scope for this video, or we could use group policy to apply it to a group of domain controllers. So let's apply it manually first. We'll go and click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch the Security Configuration Wizard again, and we'll click Next. We'll choose the third option here to apply an existing security policy, and then we'll need to browse to the location where we have our policy stored. And there's our policy, our DC policy that we just created, so we'll select that and we'll click Open. And now I'm just going to copy this file location here because we will need it later, and we'll click Next. And now we can choose which server we want to apply this policy to, and it defaults to DC01, which is this local server, but of course we can click Browse and locate another server to apply this policy to if we like, but we'll leave the default here at DC01 and we'll click Next. Now we'll get our final summary here, and once we click Next, we'll begin applying this security policy. Now this will take a few minutes, so I'm going to pause the video here and we'll return once it's done. Okay, it's done, so we'll click Next, and then Finish. Now, to deploy this security configuration policy using group policy, we'll first need to convert our XML file that we created a moment ago to a group policy object. And to do that, we'll need to click on Start and open up a command prompt. And then we'll need to run the security configuration wizard command, which is scwcmd. And then we'll need to use the transform switch. And then we'll follow that up with a /p, followed by the path to the policy. So I'm going to right click and choose paste, and we'll paste in the path to our XML file there, and then we'll need to enter in a /g followed by a name for the group policy object that we want to create. So let's just call ours DC again, and we'll hit enter. And our command completed successfully. So now if we go and click on Start and go to Administrative Tools, we'll launch the Group Policy Management Console. And then we'll expand our forest here and our domain, and Winstructor Lab, our domain. And I'll just move this window across so we can see things a little clearer. If we expand Group Policy Objects, right here at the top, we can see our new Domain Controller Policy, which we can now use to apply to our domain controllers. And this method of application is really a better way of going, since now we can apply it to all of our domain controllers at once, rather than just one at a time, which will be very time consuming. In this video, we've seen how to create a security policy using the security configuration wizard. So now you can go off and create one for your DNS servers, your DHCP servers, your file, print, web, and terminal services service, and so forth, and you can apply them all in the same way, and suddenly you've just gone now from a probably lax security to a very high security in less than a day. Now that said, personally, I would spend a little bit more time on your policies than that, since you might find if you get them wrong, suddenly your applications might stop working, or people can't connect as you've locked it down too tight, or maybe disabled a service that you really needed. So pay attention, take your time, get them right, and then go off and apply them to your OU.